a hard thing to do if you're isolated. If you're going through it, your brain is telling you I'm the only one, and you don't have the backup from another person, another man who says, no, I've gone through this too. Your experience isn't minimized in any way, but it is to say you're not, you're not weird or weak or doing something wrong for experiencing what you're doing.
Well, welcome everyone to the Rising Father podcast. I have Dr. Pierre Azzam with me, and I talked to him earlier. He's an excellent resource for men, for fathers, for anyone who needs some guidance, I think. With what I found talking to him is he's just a great person to talk to help you think in a way that is beneficial to you and to your family. And I'm really looking forward to him sharing some of his wisdom with the Rising Father community, because just from our short talk a couple weeks ago, he has a ton to offer. So welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You bet. So I asked a few questions of my community before you were on, and I'll start with a couple questions they had, because there's a lot of guys who I think who have a lot of similar type of questions. And one of the big ones that came up was, how can fathers create a better work-life balance? I think there's a lot of guys trying to hustle, trying to do multiple jobs, and also trying to be great fathers, and that really creates a conflicting situation for them.
That's a really great question. I think it's a broad one, and probably starts with identifying what that balance would entail. Usually it feels like there may be an imbalance. So some time or energy that's focused in the direction that a man wouldn't prefer. Usually that's more towards work. So I guess it starts with defining what it means to be in balance. What is feeling like it's not getting a man's energy? And perhaps the focus is really on defining how to slowly, steadily bring more energy and time to whatever it is that feels like it's deficient or not getting as much energy. Because I do think that this question's a great one. It's also really different from guy to guy. There's some similarities, but I'd say it would likely start by understanding what work-life balance even means. And how do I start with giving a little more attention to the thing that feels like it's not getting enough right now?
Where do you think guys are coming up deficient in the work or the life from what you've seen?
I think one thing that I quite often see is just personal connection to self. Having enough time to like maybe I'm rooted in what's important to me in the moment. I'm connected to myself. I think that's probably the biggest area that most of us struggle with. I mean, myself included. Like, it feels almost frivolous to say, I need to spend more time with myself, or I need to connect to myself, or to have more, with the word that's sort of thrown around a lot, self-care. It feels really frivolous, but I think it can feel really frivolous, but it's super important. And I think what often happens for most of us is that it feels like a term that's just really squishy. And so for me, self-care or time to myself is often spent doing something that I might really enjoy that doesn't feel like a task or a chore, like being out in nature, being out for a walk, not necessarily feeling restricted or like I'm obligated to do more. And that's a hard thing, I think, for many men, for me especially. I think I'm very frequently of the mindset that I need to be doing more, producing more, being more productive.
Yep.
And often that comes at the cost of me feeling a sense of peace that I could cultivate from some alone time.
Is it important for guys to have that sense of peace and happiness? Or is it okay for them to live their life, not entire life, but is it okay to live parts of your life with that sense of urgency and not even unhealthy, but that hustle and grind mentality? Like, is pursuing the peace and happiness necessary and better for the person?
Well, I think most things, as with most things, it's all about moderation and intention. There are likely going to be times in life where hustling is key.
Yep.
Or times of the week where hustling is key. But if hustling is 24/7 without any time for peace, most guys are going to get burned out.
Yep.
And if the reverse happens and it's all peace, most guys are going to get a little restless. So I do think it is a matter of finding some moderation, but also recognizing what's important to each man at his stage of life, where he is in terms of cultivating growth versus peace. I think the two need to coincide and live together, maybe sort of coexist. But perhaps they get fed in different, but they do get fed in different ways. So I think there's a big emphasis on the hustle. I mean, we see the hustle, especially on social media. We see the hustle being really honored as the way that men ought to show up.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there's value there, certainly. I don't mean to diminish it in any way. I think it's how we build, how we grow. I think it's got to be tempered, though, for most men, by some level of peace. Else the hustle starts to feel overwhelming, and we lose perspective over much of the reason why the hustle's even happening in the first place.
And I think for a lot of guys, they are hustling and grinding so much because they don't know what they're trying to do. You feel you get motivated by someone on social media who tells you to grind and hustle, so you work yourself up into this emotion and state where you have to be hustling and grinding and working, but you've got no direction, you've got no guidance, so you end up just repeating the cycle for years and years. And I talk about this to people who are trying to, build a business or a brand or anything like that. It's working hard is great, and trying really hard is admirable and noble. But if you don't know what you're doing, you're going to be repeating the cycle over and over and over again. And from my perspective, I try to tell guys, working hard and attaining goals and getting to these personal benchmarks is great, but not if it's at the expense of what you're trying to attain. Like if you're trying to attain personal freedom and, time with your family and freedom of time, then constantly restarting for 18 years and never getting ahead and burning yourself out, and then your kids go to college and then say, hey, I finally figured it out, you miss the whole point of what you were trying to do.
Yeah. Yeah, it's important. So maintaining this perspective on what's at stake and what's the goal feels urgent.
Yeah. And it's tough for guys, I think, because they want to be motivated and they want to be inspired. And there's a lot of inspiring people on social media. But, I know personally a lot of guys who start and stop many different things because they're just so easily inspired. And, they'll watch one guy who says do this, they'll watch another guy who says do this, they'll watch another guy who says hustle 24/7, they'll watch another guy who says something else. And part of that, I think, comes back to, lack of maybe, a father figure still being influential in their life, and they're looking for their own kind of guidance. But I think it really puts a lot of guys into this like hamster wheel of never really getting to the destination they want to be, and just constantly searching for that feeling of fulfillment that someone's promising them.
I think it's a big challenge for most men. We want to feel fulfilled or enough more than we are at any given moment. But sometimes we go through the motions without certainly, I guess I should speak to my own experience maybe, but I've gone through the motions for years without necessarily knowing exactly what it is that I wanted. Or even realizing that what I wanted was a slowdown. It wasn't to speed up and to get more, to collect more things. Or to collect more accolade. It was really to slow down. But I do think that requires a level of self-awareness, and slowing down is key to developing that self-awareness. And most guys, myself included, feel uncomfortable slowing down. It feels weird. It feels like we don't deserve it. It feels frivolous. It feels unproductive. And it's also critical to appreciating, where do I want to go? Where do I want to take, especially to guys who are listening here, where do I want to go, and also invite my family to go with me? And that does require a bit of slowdown.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to do that. And I know for me personally also, especially if you're in a building type of phase where, well, I also think that a lot of people are never out of the building type of phase. They're always going from thing to thing to thing. But yeah, you really do think that if I lay off the gas a little bit right now, and I don't, I've got 30 minutes of extra time. If I don't be productive with that 30 minutes of extra time, then I'm like sacrificing my future a little bit.
Yep.
Like that thought, that's a powerful thought, and that's a thought that's in there.
Yeah, for sure. It's a thought that I contend with, feels like all the time. And even though I know that there are times and value in slowing down, that thought will emerge. I almost see it as not something that we could ever get rid of. Nor should we try to. There's something important to that thought. There are times in which that desire to hustle, the thought to do more, is actually quite valuable. But there are also times in which that thought is a distraction. And so it does become important to be able to recognize, well, that's a thought that's going to emerge from time to time. It's a part of how I show up, this desire for more. And that doesn't necessarily mean more material things, but I think for many men there's a desire to have more substance, to have more impact, to have more value in a a way that feels a little more tangible. And so it can seem counterintuitive then in the moments where the thought comes up, I need to hustle, I need to go farther, to say, well, my intention here was actually to slow down.
Mm-hmm. When that happens to you, do you force? Yeah. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. You first.
When that happens,
I think we're on the same page. Yeah.
So. If that happens to you personally, when that does, do you just force yourself to like say, oh, I've got an hour. I know I should be slowing down, but I've got this list of stuff that I could do. And if I did this list of things, maybe I could get ahead to get closer to the sum goal. Do you just stop yourself and force yourself to slow down?
Yeah. Well, I think we were getting at the same point here, which is how do you approach that when the thought emerges? I do think it's, in essence, this process of mindfulness that comes up over and over again in meditative practices, where a thought emerges and we recognize it's a distraction, and then the intention is to return the focus back to our target, our anchor. Usually in meditation, that's our breath. But in a lot of ways, meditation then becomes training for mindful, intentional action. And so in those moments, it can be very tempting to go down the rabbit hole of going through my list. And so I see it less as a force and more of a return. I think if I try to force it too much and I say, no, take it away, I'm returning back to just slowing down and I'm going to force myself to slow down, I usually invite a lot more judgmental thoughts, distracting thoughts that don't allow me to peacefully return to slowing down. Because a forceful slowdown doesn't usually end up working very well, at least not for me. Mm-hmm. I usually recognize too, this is a thought that isn't in line with my intended action, which is to be more aware, to slow down, to not work. This is something to which I could return at a different time. It's not something that I'm necessarily going to try to force myself away from, because that ends up creating additional distracting thoughts and energy. And so I do think in a lot of ways, like I remember when I first became interested in mindfulness and meditation, I would hear meditation instructors use the word gently. And they would say, gently return to your breath, or gently put aside the thought, recognize it's there, and gently return to your breath. And I used to think, like, I'm not a very sort of woo guy, I guess. Mm-hmm. I remember the first few times I heard that thinking, well, why gently? Like, is that just an addition to the practice that feels kind of woo and sort of squishy? But it's hugely important. If I try to force my thought back to my intention or my intended action, inevitably there will be other distracting thoughts and judgments that will emerge. I'll say, I can't do this. I'm not good at this. I'll essentially bring up all of these additional distracting elements rather than just allowing my attention to go back to what my anchor is. And doing it in a way that allows me to build some practice to doing it in a peaceful manner, where the more I do it over and over again, the more comfortable it becomes. It may not be completely devoid of distraction. That's not the point. The point is not to force the thoughts away. The point is just to return your energy, your attention, your awareness back to the target, which in this case is connection to yourself, slowing down. allowing yourself to gain more insight to who you are and what you want.
That's real. Those are wise words, but they're hard words to do. Those are difficult concepts to wrap your head around and to put into practice. I've tried and given up on meditation a few times over the past 5 years because for the same reasons I've told you that make other guys want to do things. I saw someone else say it was important. So I tried it, but it does require time. And, even though I know the benefit is there, it's just a hard thing to do. Like I did yoga for a time, and that was hard. And just like, I wish I still did yoga. Like I wish I never stopped trying to get better at meditation because our brain is so tricky and screws with us so much. It's so hard when you're trying to do that. And whenever you do have these outside thoughts come in, it's so hard not to dive into them and entertain them instead of just, watching them float by, acknowledging them, not being judgmental. And I think that was a big issue I had. And I found a lot of, I think, wisdom in like Buddhist practice. And there's a podcast called Secular Buddhism, and the guy talks about meditation and not like punishing yourself twice. Like you're trying to meditate, a thought comes in that you don't want, and then you get mad at yourself for that thought. So like you're punishing yourself twice, whenever that happens. And I thought that was just extremely wise, and I love that whole philosophy of thinking about emotions and outside thoughts. But it's definitely difficult to control your thoughts in that way.
Well, I appreciate that because I think it's really a hard practice. I also see it more as training for something more important, which is generally engaging in a mindful way. And I think the punishing yourself twice is an important factor here in the gentle return back to whatever your focus is. And when it's forced, it usually ends up being judged, and the judgment is distracting. I would also argue the point isn't really to force your thoughts or to even control them. The point is to recognize that they're going to come up sometimes in ways that are aligned with your intention, and quite often in ways that are not. Quite often in ways that will distract you, deter you, judge you, make assumptions that aren't useful. And entertaining those thoughts or going down the rabbit hole of those thoughts is quite often where a lot of suffering happens for us, especially guys, because we can quite easily live in our heads.
Oh, yeah. And I know we talked about this before, and that happens the more and more I think guys get older, the less they start reaching out to other men, the more resistant they are to therapy or to talk to their friends. And then that just creates this internal bubble in which they live.
Yeah.
What are some of the reasons guys are resistant to sharing their thoughts and, seeking out help, seeking out therapy, seeking like a confidant?
The reluctance is, for many guys, strong. It can be really innate. And without awareness, some guys will just feel very reluctant to share our experiences. But it often amounts to a few different interpretations or assumptions. One is that I'm alone, different, somehow sharing my struggle will set me apart as less than. I think that's a big one.
Be seen as weak.
Yeah. Yeah, I think to that point, that is its own, this fear of vulnerability or weakness. That somehow naming a need, naming a want for help, means I'm sitting face to face with my vulnerability and I'm letting someone else in on that. I think a third one tends to be a feeling of burden. No one wants to hear what I have to say. No one wants to hear me complain. Seeing a personal share, and especially a vulnerable share, as somehow an imposition on another person. I guess the fourth is that many of us think and want to think that we can do it all on our own. That somehow being able to maneuver and sorting it all out on our own feels more important than, in some cases, more important than actually sorting it out.
Just saying that you did it on your own.
Yeah.
That
There's something big to that. I mean,
you conquered it.
Uh-huh. Yeah. I mean, I think about a lot of hesitation around getting psychotherapy or taking medications for mental health conditions that have nothing to do with our control and nothing to do with our own individual capacity or strength. And often there's a reluctance, a resistance. I don't want to rely on a medication, or I don't want to have to use this as a crutch. Well, it's not, and you wouldn't think that in the context of any other medical condition. But somehow there is a sense that if I'm struggling from an emotional or a mental health standpoint, that there's a judgment of weakness that's associated with it, or a judgment to my strength. And that is especially true for men. That tends to be a big barrier.
What percentage of men, I know this is you're not going to have an exact answer, but what's your guesstimation of what percentage of guys have these internal mental struggles that they're going through, and they think they're the only one?
Oh, a huge percentage.
Like over 50?
Yeah.
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 And I'm just thinking that there's whoever's listening to this, like, you probably are thinking you're like no one else is going through what you're going through, and if you if you said something, people would think you're weird. But like, I'm sure if you've had 10 random guys off the street in a room, you told them the thoughts that you had, they'd probably all be like, "Oh yeah, I'm thinking the same thing."
Yep, Chris, well over 50.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know that anyone can actually get an exact estimate, but I would assume that the clear majority of men are experiencing, at least at some point and in some aspect of their lives, a struggle that they think they are alone in experiencing.
And that no one else has gone through, and that they're unique in that. And it's weird because I'm thinking like, where's this isolation come from? What makes them want to keep it to themselves? But it affects everyone. I mean, I've had the same thoughts too. It's not that I share everything also, because you also go through different phases. Like, there's phases where I guess physically I'm feeling better, mentally I'm feeling better, things are going well in all these areas of my life, and I'm just more open to talk to people about it. But then there's also physiologically or whatever, you go through different phases and you're just a little more down on yourself. And even though you should be sharing with people, you bottle it all up inside, and you just want to put your head down, grind to yourself, and not share anything with anyone, and that just turns into a spiral.
For sure. And if we think about just the common experiences of mood decline or anxiety, they are within the normal range of things that we all experience. Mood declines, experiences particularly around big life transitions, including fatherhood, that are really common. We also think about when something goes from maybe a normal human experience to pathology. And that can be kind of a fuzzy line. When something the experience goes from anxiety related to a particular situation to a persisting anxiety condition, or sadness, grief, turns into something like a major depressive episode.
I didn't know what you meant. You meant from like whenever you feeling a certain way, feeling down one day, to that becoming an actual condition.
Yeah. I mean, our moods all fluctuate.
Yeah.
And we're in the normal range. You're going to have days when you feel sad. And symptoms or experiences that look like symptoms of depression. But the lines between normal human experience and pathology can sometimes be a little fuzzy. I mean, in many ways they're man-made. They're devised based on clusters of symptoms for certain periods of time. But you think about even those experiences, sadness or the experiences of major depression or anxiety, they're self-perpetuating in a lot of ways. The thoughts that men will experience when we experience depression will often take us to places of wanting to withdraw, of feeling guilty or worthless or hopeless. And that keeps us from getting the things that we need, like connection or help or physical activity. The very conditions themselves interfere with the very things that we need in order to get well. And so sometimes it's a matter of normalizing the experience, but it's a hard thing to do if you're isolated. If you're going through it, your brain is telling you, I'm the only one, and you don't have the backup from another person, another man, who says, no, I've gone through this too. Your experience isn't minimized in any way, but it is to say, you're not weird or weak or doing something wrong for experiencing what you're doing or experiencing what you're experiencing.
Have you found guys that have been working with you or other therapists have had real changes in their perspective on this?
Oh, yeah. 100%. And in fairness, I think that it doesn't, I think that I've seen this a lot in individual work that I've done and that others have done with men. But I also see this a lot even when men start to engage in groups. Mm. And so it's not necessarily to diminish the importance of doing one-on-one work. I think that's hugely important. Obviously, it's my livelihood and what I feel very passionately about doing. It's an important mission to me. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't always take that level of in-depth one-on-one work in order to achieve it. In fact, it just takes interacting with a man or a few men who can tell you, I've experienced this. You're not alone. This is how I got through it, but more importantly, you've got people around you who are in your corner who will help you get through it in your own way.
I couldn't agree more. It's almost part of our new modern culture, I think, that is causing all these issues. Because I would assume that before all of our cell phones and laptops and screens, there was more of a need to reach out to people personally and get what you needed from them face to face, which led to conversations in groups. So I would imagine, and I have no studies or anything to back this up, but I would imagine that over the last 50 years or so, especially with cell phones, it's just creating so many more mental health issues resulting from guys not being able to connect.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think isolation has basically become endemic to men. It's so common that, you know, you see it as not a side effect or risk factor for many mental health conditions. And my assumption in general is that if I see a man that he's likely to have limited social support. Not every man.
Just percentage-wise, he's probably...
His risk of it is definitely higher than perhaps it was 20 years ago, but certainly higher for the average man than for the average woman.
Because guys are more likely to, or women are more likely to socialize, and yeah.
And you know, that's not. It's important to say this because it's not alone. It's an important risk factor, but it's not the only one. I mean, on the whole, women face many mental health conditions more commonly than men. And, you know, depending on the condition itself, there may be biases around reporting. Guys are less likely to report symptoms of depression, for example. We're less likely to report symptoms that coincide with the diagnostic criteria for depression. But clearly it's not the only factor that comes into play. There are lots of factors at play. It is an important factor because it's so common. And theoretically, it feels like it would be maybe an easy fix. You'd think that the sort of connectedness that allows us, that we have to one another, you and I being able to get on a call like this and connect in some way from 1,000 miles apart would be enough. But I think that there's something to a level of shared vulnerability, shared strength and shared vulnerability that allows for connection. And there are all sorts of walls and barriers that many men put up. I know I've spent much of my life putting them up. They're protective. They fit with the sort of narrative that we hear about how men ought to show up. But they keep us from deeper connection. They keep us from feeling connected even when we have a lot of people around us. And so I think that a level of connectedness might be just as high, if not higher, than 20, 30, 40 years ago. But the level of loneliness feels different. And so the two feel, they're obviously, they've got some correlation, but you can certainly be very connected and still feel very alone or very lonely. And I think the combating element to that is a level of vulnerable share. And I think it's what often we see happen really well if we look at mom groups, for example. I think there's a level of building one another up and normalizing vulnerable experiences. And it's a lagging kind of a thing for most men. I think we're both here doing work that is helping men to connect and to share strength and vulnerability in ways that feel approachable to men. But it's a slow and still kind of a lagging thing for many men, for many fathers. to connect in a way in which shared strength and shared vulnerability are applauded.
Yeah, I'll do in my groups, I'll do some questionnaires and questions of the group. And you're inevitably going to get the tough guys who, I'll ask a question about, something. What's your favorite memory with your child? Or well, what's one thing you can work on as a father today? Something like that. And you're always going to get the one guy who, no matter what, has to display to everyone how tough he is in that situation. And I'll do something like, hey, when's the last time you hung out with your friends? Or do you guys ever hang out with your friends? There's one guy who's, I don't need friends. I'm on my own. That's I can go through life just with my family and myself and blah blah blah. And that it happens every single time. Like there's this constant need to display to people kind of exactly what you're saying. Like, I can do it on my own. I am this lone crusader going on this mission, and I'll die on the hill. And I don't know why that continues to happen, but it's probably contributing to a lot of the mental distress that you're talking about. Is this fantasy about like the crusader, the warrior, who's going on this mission alone, and even if he's broke and dead by the end of it, it's okay. It doesn't matter because his story's going to be great. And not realizing that along the way he's destroying himself, he's ruining his relationships with his friends and family, and this narrative that he gave himself is leading him down a bad path.
Yeah, that's really common. And gets me wondering how you respond. How do you find yourself compelled to respond? And how do other people in your group respond?
Well, the guys that agree with him will like it, comment, hell yeah, thumbs up. Because they don't have the they didn't have the guts to put that comment themselves and put themselves out there, but they will say that because now they look up to that guy, like he's the strong one, and then that guy just created some followers for that line of thinking. So for me, I leave that comment up and I use it as to try to show people my way of thinking, and I'll take my time and leave a detailed comment. Explaining how I think differently about this, and I try to write it in a way that people can follow along and learn from. And because like whenever you're dealing with social media or anything like that, you can either negative comments or comments that attack what you're saying, you can either get rid of them or you can use them as an advertisement for what you're trying to say. Because it's kind of like objection handling with sales. Like if you're trying to sell something, someone's saying, oh, that's too expensive because blank, and they write that down. And you can say, actually, it's not that expensive because of these 10 reasons. And then someone who's considering to buy your product, can read over your explanation, and you're handling their objections before they even buy it. So that's kind of how I think about comments that are anti my message.
For sure, 100%. I'd say in this case, the I don't need friends, it would sort of be in line with what is commonly referred to at least in research around men's mental health as a core element to traditional masculine ideology, which often holds that men are that we expect ourselves, and then perhaps other people expect us to be lone wolves and the alpha, to be competent at everything, to be entirely self-sufficient, to be daring, to be willing to take risks.
You can make a whole brand about that. I see so many memes in dad groups.
For sure.
Just, the lion with blood on his face, like, I don't need my friend, but just that's such a message.
It's a huge message. Well, the reality of at least research that's been done around mental health is that men who hold on to these rules very rigidly are also the men who are highly at risk for mental health conditions like depression. And it's not to say that men who don't hold on to rigid rules of traditional masculine ideology don't suffer, but it is to say that there are a slew of reasons not to hold on to these sort of traditional man laws in such a rigid way. To recognize that some of the attributes like self-sufficiency, strength, daring, honor, competence, those are valuable. But when held on to in these rigid ways that are excessive, that are superhuman, that are inflexible, that don't fit for most of us, don't fit for humans, that they actually do us a disservice. They keep us from being our best selves. If we're just looking at the context of self-sufficiency, saying, I don't have friends because I don't need friends, might sound somehow really, I don't know, compelling. Maybe certain men can get behind it because it sounds strong. But the reality is, guys who are lonely, who don't have a social support, are the guys who struggle. They're the guys who have a harder time facing big life changes, especially fatherhood, in a healthy, productive, strong way. And so there's value here in the response that you give. There's value in not applauding this as the only or the uber masculine ideal to which we should all strive. In fact, it puts us in a place of potential risk to do it, to ourselves and to other people. And so a more realistic viewpoint would be to applaud self-sufficiency, but also to applaud the reaching out, the teamwork, the collaboration that's associated with having friends. There's some really wonderful things that are associated with having a team of people around you, having some brotherhood in your life that most men don't get to experience without some connection, without loosening the rigid expectations and norms, maybe even rewriting them.
My response is usually along the lines of, when I hang out with my friends, it makes me happier, which makes me a better husband and father. It's usually some version of that.
Yeah, brilliant.
And
in a lot of ways, it's personal. It doesn't diminish the other person. It invites the other person to consider, well, maybe there's a different viewpoint.
Yeah, and I try not to be judgmental about it. I just say, this is why I make a priority to see my friends and to hang out with them. It's not because I'm selfish. It's not selfish to hang out with friends. It's because it's important to my wife and my kids that I hang out with my friends. And if I'm happier, then my wife's going to get a better version of me. My kids are going to get a better version of me. Plus, I want my wife to hang out with her friends. I want my kids to have lots of friends and be social, because that's a skill in itself. And I want them to see their dad hanging out with friends. I mean, my kids see me hanging out with friends all the time, and my guy friends are some of my kids' closest friends now, because we do it so much. And I think back to probably a romantic version of the way things used to be, where people lived in more village-like areas, and they had a bigger sense of community. Like I'm growing up pre-cell phone, like we used to have block parties, And we knew everyone on our street, and all the kids would get together and play release and night tag, and
Yeah.
the parents would yell at the other kids in the block. Like, if I was screwing up, my neighbor would yell at me. My mom was fine with it. She didn't come out and call a lawyer,
Uh-huh.
And all of that is kind of missing right now. And I can't create that exact situation, but it's much more healthier for my kids, I think, if they've got multiple adults giving them wisdom. Like my son, one of my best friends just loves talking about WWE and wrestling and everything. And I don't know anything about it. So my kid and him on one of our vacations just went all week just talking about WWE, and now he has this great connection with my son. And then he was telling him, like, we went fishing one time, and my buddy and him were like sitting together fishing, talking, and I heard him over talking about like wisdom about, taking the hook out of the fish and worms and just like stuff that I wasn't even thinking of, wasn't on my radar. And if I wouldn't have put him in that situation, he wouldn't have got it. And that's not a selfish thing of me. That's because friends are valuable to me. Now my son has extra wisdom in his life.
For sure. And the opportunity to connect to people on the regular, which I think that's another thing. Even the capacity to interact can feel threatening if you don't have that connection early, those sort of secure connections, secure levels of attachment with people around you at a very early stage. It can be harder to build the awareness, the practice, the safety in connecting to other people later in life too. So you're giving your kids not only a model for cultivating friendship, but an opportunity to connect to people and for it to be just a regular part of their lives, which I don't think that's universal, especially in the West.
No. And
Yeah.
I've told you this before, like anytime I poll people, how many of us guys have friends, it's always at least 80-90%. No one has friends. And I don't think they're counting their social media friends as friends, because it is different. And I wish that wasn't the case. So I've just, man, go join a gym. You don't have to be ripped. You don't have to be the ripped guys you see on Instagram. Just join a jiu-jitsu gym, join a boxing club, join a physical gym. Like my wife and kids are at CrossFit right now. That, they've all got 30 new friends. They all hang out. You don't have to be perfect to join these clubs. There's so many, if you just Google it, you can find societies, clubs, so many things in your area you could probably walk to or take a short Uber ride and just meet people who are exactly like you, who after a couple weeks you'll be texting each other, you'll be hanging out, you'll have fun groups to go to, and you'll be a different person. Like, man, after I hang out with my friends, I'm a different person.
Yeah. I'd argue too that there's some value in not being perfect in social situations, especially, but even in physical activity situations, in CrossFit boxes or gyms or otherwise. I mean, there is this desire, I think, socially, and this is certainly true for men, because so much of the kind of traditional ideology around masculinity involves appearing competent and strong. And there is a sense then that I need to be somehow one-upping, or I need to show up in the perfect way. If I'm not one-upping, then I need to show up in the perfect way. And in fact, it's often the imperfections that bind us, that connect us. The people who show up as 100% perfect, completely chiseled and ripped, might get some attention in terms of, like, applauding an appearance or a physique or a level of strength that doesn't necessarily translate to connectedness. In fact, sometimes it means people who appear really polished may seem like they have it all together, and why would they want to be friends with me? And so there's some value here to even recognizing just being authentic and being interested in connecting can be really powerful. You don't have to have the perfect line to say hello or come across as, like you've got it all figured out for yourself. In fact, it can be hugely connective to just be authentic and a little bit vulnerable.
Could one of the reasons do guys have this false wall or false identity, or I guess need to say, I'm strong, I don't need anyone? It's kind of like a character they're painting, they're building, that they're showing to the world, saying, that's who I am, not me. Is one of the reasons the guys do that because they're lacking some inner fulfillment? Now, this is kind of like a loaded question because it's really just my opinion. So
yeah, fair.
I'm kind of saying, do you agree with me? So one of the things I think is that, guys say those kind of things and put on, their profile pictures of a lion growling and everything they say is tough because when they go home, maybe they just, instead of working on a passion project or hanging out with friends or doing a hobby or having meaningful connections, they're lacking in that area. Is that that's kind of my personal opinion, I think.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, it would fit. I think there are a lot of reasons why guys will showcase a part of or a story that may or may not fit what's happening on the inside. I mean, a lot of us put up walls and we show fronts that we want to look good. And maybe that is a bit of insecurity around what's happening on the inside or a lack of fulfillment. Maybe that makes up for it. I think it's variable. I think there are a lot of reasons why guys would, and not just would, but do that. I mean, you see it a lot on social media, certainly on Instagram, where so much of the interaction is based on an image. There is a desire to showcase the highlights. And I also think there's an element of fear associated with showing anything that might be vulnerable, which I think in a lot of ways has been a big part of my own mission to show bravery and courage in sharing authentic vulnerability. I think that in many cases we haven't had a lot of models of men doing that in either in our lives or around us, certainly not on social media. And so it may seem like in order to garner attention and connection, I have to showcase something that lives up to an image. So I think it inherently means that there's a need. And that need might be to fulfill a sense of security or a fulfillment that might not be there. But it may also be to garner respect or support or connection that otherwise we don't have in our lives in real time. So it could be lots of things. I think your theory is has got some weight. It holds some water.
Is that what Braver Man's all about? It's being brave enough to be vulnerable?
Yeah. It's recognizing an important element of bravery through shared vulnerability and being authentic about it. And recognizing, too, that the shared degree of vulnerability means that I'm opening myself up to ways to get stronger, to become braver. But yeah, that was very much at the heart of the start of Braver Man, very much at the heart of the mission of my work.
When guys become fathers, they go through a massive change. And I can't remember if I talked to you about this. I talked to someone about almost like postpartum depression in men.
Yeah,
Whenever
we
after
did.
after they go through fatherhood, and that was kind of startling to me. And we didn't cover that, and I do want to touch on that
Yeah,
because a lot of fathers, obviously are in the community, and I think most people think of that as a purely motherhood thing, and it's also a very vague term. I think that could encompass a lot of different symptoms or actions or behaviors. So, what does that look like for guys?
yeah. It is quite real for men. So about 10% of fathers will experience postpartum depression in the first year of fatherhood. And that, by the book, looks like at least 2 weeks of major depressive symptoms, usually a decline in mood, a change in level of interest or hope, with symptoms like disturbances to sleep and energy and appetite and motivation and concentration, sluggishness or restlessness, hopelessness, loss of interest or pleasure. Now, a lot of these, right? I mean, there's a team of fathers here who are going to say, well, implicitly, fatherhood involves a lot of sleepless nights, some decline in energy and motivation and interest, and changes to level of interest. And so, important to note a few things here. Often, for men, for fathers, postpartum depression will show up with some additional features. It will tend to show up with an uncharacteristic degree of indecisiveness, feeling uncertain about myself, feeling guilty or worthless, attacks of anger, getting really irritable, really snappy. It will also tend to show up with feeling numb. I think more often than is recognized, guys may not say I'm feeling depressed, but I'm feeling depleted or numb. And also, as part of depression, men have a higher risk of turning to substances, spending or gambling or risky sex in ways to avoid the numbing.
Is this a biological thing, or like what postpartum depression? Like I was always never totally clear on, like, is this something that happens because of the chemicals and hormones that are happening, or is it a situational situation?
Yeah, I mean, the answer to that is yes, to both. Okay. There are innate changes to hormone levels, and fluxes in testosterone usually drops.
Okay.
Fluxes in estrogen and cortisol and oxytocin that are all designed to help dads bond with their babies in the first few weeks and months of fatherhood.
So testosterone actually drops.
It does. And so there are physiological risk factors that increase the likelihood for a man to experience a major depressive episode in that first year. But we also know that there are additional risk factors that are situational. Fathers who are excluded from baby bonding. Fathers, moms as well, in which that primary relationship, the relationship between mom and dad, is rocky or struggling. That is a major risk factor. Lack of social supports. it feels like lack of social supports, at least in mental health and psychiatry, comes up really commonly as a risk factor for many mental health conditions. And it's a risk factor for this one. And so when dad feels isolated, both from bonding with the baby, but also from community, that's a risk factor as well. When mom is experiencing postpartum depression, that risk ramps up tremendously. It becomes 25 to 50%. It goes up from 1 in 10 men to 1 in 2 to 4 men. And so if mom is experiencing postpartum depression, the likelihood that dad will also have postpartum depression is super high.
Wow, you said 2 out of 4 to 50%.
It's either, the studies suggest somewhere between 1 in 2 and 1 in 4. So 25 to 50%.
Wow, that's wild.
Yeah.
There's a guy I know. He became a father, completely changed, and not for the better. He all throughout high school, he's jock, super strong, happy, college party guy, super strong, happy, and he got married. They had a kid, and I think it's kind of what you're saying now. The wife had definitely had postpartum depression, like a serious episode, and that was like 4 or 5 years ago. And him like, he is completely changed. He's packed on weight, never wants to hang out, doesn't have any hobbies, no passion, stopped going to the gym. He's kind of a shell of his former self. And from the outside looking in, without giving him a diagnosis, I would say he's depressed. But it's been 4 or 5 years. And it's really serious. Just a completely different person, from the person that we knew. And not that like I'm blaming the wife, but they're both like in this black hole together. They need someone to pull them out.
Yeah, that's unfortunately not uncommon. I'd say too, there's some unknown features of depression generally. I think one thing is that because the diagnostic criteria by the book, a depressive episode is defined to last for 2 weeks or more, there's a sense that this is a condition that on average impacts people on the order of weeks. It's not. The average duration of a major depressive episode is 4 to 12 months. And in most cases, the experience isn't a one and done kind of a thing. It's I think research on postpartum depression in men hasn't sort of fully clarified this in terms of risk beyond the postpartum period. But for men who experience major depressive episode with at least one episode, if a guy experiences one episode, his likelihood to have another is about 50%. Thereafter, it's about 75%. After 3 episodes, it's about 90%. And so the likelihood is that most people who experience depressive episodes will experience them on a recurrent basis. It's important to know it's not necessarily a one and done thing, that it can take up a huge chunk of people's lives on the order of months to years per episode, which is why I think the World Health Organization is expecting it to be the second leading cause of disability by, I think, 2024. Ooh. And so it is important to recognize that depression alone really impacts people's lives in ways that can be very subtle, but also ways that are very powerful, very, very strong and impactful. And I think therein lies the importance of considering ways to combat risk factors like isolation. If we just look at this from the standpoint of public health, if we just look at this from the standpoint of being fulfilled, being happy, feeling like you're successful in whatever your description of the word is, doesn't have to be in terms of money or belongings or anything. There's huge value to combating isolation, to building community. When we think about public health, it's massive. People who are lonely are more likely to experience these depressive episodes. People who feel disconnected are likely to experience more severe episodes. And so I think there's something really important to recognizing the power of depression and other conditions like it, and the risk that's associated with early fatherhood. And you've got all kinds of other risk factors. You've got changes to sleep patterns, just the sheer stress that's associated, no doubt, with having to take care of a baby, and concerns about mom's health and baby's health, and a desire to show up in the best possible way. Lots of pressures that may be placed upon you by society, or maybe more likely by ourselves. So the early fatherhood, the early parenthood period is an especially risky time for mom and dad.
And if guys would just reach out to someone, I feel like that could break a cycle. If, you could go through like the guy I know. I try to talk to him, and I'm no therapist, but I try to offer some insight, or to at least just listen. Mm-hmm. But what I hear a lot of is denial that anything is wrong, or kind of the tough guy narrative that this is the way it is right now. It's supposed to be hard. One day it'll be different. And, this person I know has been saying this for 5 years, and it's apparent to everyone else that they're not in a good place. And it's supposed to be hard. It's supposed to be tough. It's just the way it is right now. It'll get better someday. That's like a trap that I think you can tell yourself because it feels good. But it's like, no, if this person would just talk to you, maybe you could say 2 sentences to him that would offer some insight and lessen the weight of these internal thoughts. So I feel like a lot of guys have so many barriers in their brains or messages that they've convinced themselves are the absolute truth, that it's so hard to bust through and say, just put those down for a couple minutes, listen to what I have to say. There is another life out there for you. You don't have to be stressed and upset and miserable all the time. You don't have to be. But it's so many guys have these blocks, these walls, and these 10 commandments of the way I live my life and the way I have to feel, that it's really hard to bust through. I would imagine that whenever you're talking to some new clients or guys, that you deal with that a little bit. Is yes, you've thought this for 40 years. How about this?
Yeah, for sure. I think there's some awareness too that those thoughts that have been at the fore for the last 40 years or however many years are unlikely to just go away. And in some ways patterns have served us.
Yes.
And I think to your point here, letting someone know if something changes, I'm here. if you need an ear, you know where to reach me. I'm going to check in on you anyway. You might say the same thing every time, but I'm here. I think that's really powerful, probably more so than preaching or forcing a way to help. Not everyone will respond with help seeking, but if they find themselves needing help, wanting help, being willing to seek it, then they know you're there. They know you care. And it feels like those messages they're not always very satisfying, because there's a sort of a part of all of us that wants to help people to get to a place where they're no longer suffering, and it's painful to see people we care about suffer in a way. There's also something really important that often gets picked up on when you're honest about a desire to help somebody, when you're honest about your care for somebody. That even if you don't have all the answers, you can't force them to do anything. Even if they came to you, you may not have a way to fix anything. They know maybe they're just not quite as alone as they thought that they were. And so I think there's something really powerful just to being able to listen and to voice a genuine level of concern for another man that I don't think we see modeled very frequently. And I also think we don't really get the invite to share from one guy to another.
Yeah.
Again, it doesn't always fit into the sort of traditional norms, but it's super powerful. Most men are longing for it. We're longing for connection.
Sometimes you go out with your buddies, finally your buddy gets one night out to hang out, and you go to a bar, you're drinking, telling jokes. I mean, the last thing that a guy wants to do to his friend is get serious and have that, and say, hey, I noticed that you're having some issues, man. Let's talk about it. And if that guy can only go out once a month or once every 3 months, it's hard to make that time, which is why I think it's important to set aside time with someone to actually help you.
I agree. And it may not be in that moment.
Yeah.
Maybe at a different time. Hey, I loved hanging out with you tonight. And also, if something comes up between now and the next time we get the chance to hang out, you know how to reach me. Is it all right if I reach out to you just to check in now and then? Most guys are going to be open to that. I think it's rare that you're going to get a guy who's going to be closed off to it.
All right, man. I will wrap this up. I don't want to take any more of your time. I really
appreciate you.
It. Yes, this is a great conversation. I think a ton of guys can find so much value in what you're saying because it's so different from what's out there.
Thank you.
Not many people are saying, have your message. The main message you will find is, wake up at 2 a.m., get your 8-pack on, hustle 20 out of the 24 hours of the day, and you're saying slow down, take care of yourself, it's okay, and I just love that. I think that so many guys I'm repeating myself, but so many guys are in that trap. And I find myself there too, of just wanting to constantly achieve more and more and more and more. And then what you're not realizing you're doing is you're actually slowing yourself down by not taking care of yourself. So find Dr. Pierre Azzam on Instagram, and I'll let you tell people where else, but it's Braver Man on Instagram.
Sure.
Find all his stuff. So where can people find you?
Yeah, quickest way is through Instagram. The handle's @braver.man.
Yeah. And can't recommend him enough, guys. Check him out, and he just shares so much wisdom and value on his page all the time. So you can get your own free consultation just by going through his posts. He's very, very helpful.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Chris.
All right. I appreciate you, buddy.
I appreciate you as well.